The courtroom was packed that morning, a routine hearing in what was supposed to be a minor misdemeanor case involving a teenager named Marcus Lane. He was just 17, tall, quiet, well-dressed, and accused of disorderly conduct after a heated dispute with a school officer. His public defender sat next to him, flipping through papers, while the prosecutor read silently at the other table. The judge hadn't arrived yet. Most people in the room were chatting quietly or checking their phones. But the bailiff, Officer Halbridge, stood rigidly by the bench, arms crossed, glaring at Marcus as if the boy had personally insulted his family. Marcus sat still. He didn't fidget or talk. He just looked down at his hands, folded in his lap. Then the door creaked open, and an elderly woman in a shawl walked in slowly. Marcus turned to smile at her, his grandmother. She nodded gently and took a seat in the back. That's when Officer Halbridge walked straight toward Marcus. "What are you smiling at, kid?" he barked, loud enough that heads turned. Marcus looked confused. "Just saw my grandma," he replied, barely above a whisper. "Don't get smart with me." "I wasn't," and then it happened. The officer reached out and slapped Marcus across the face. The crack echoed through the courtroom like a gunshot. Gasps filled the room. A woman screamed. The public defender jumped to his feet, yelling, "Hey! You can't!" Before anyone could react further, the double doors at the back of the courtroom burst open. A man in a tailored charcoal gray suit walked in with an expression so icy and controlled it silenced the room instantly. He moved with purpose, his steps deliberate, as if he belonged there, because he did. He approached the bench, locked eyes with Officer Halbridge, and calmly said, "You just put your hands on a federal agent's son." The room froze. Even Halbridge took a step back, suddenly pale. For a long moment, no one spoke. The room hung in silence like the air before a thunderstorm. The man in the gray suit reached into his inner jacket pocket, slowly, deliberately, and pulled out a leather case. He flipped it open, holding it up for everyone to see. "Special Agent Darius Lane. Internal Affairs, Federal Division," he said clearly. "You just assaulted my son." The judge had just entered through her side door and stopped mid-step. "Excuse me, what's going on?" The public defender was the first to regain his voice. "Your Honor, this officer just struck my client. Unprovoked. In front of dozens of witnesses." Darius didn't break eye contact with Halbridge. "I suggest you take a seat, officer. This is already going to internal review." Halbridge's hands trembled slightly. I didn't know he was that shouldn't matter," Darius said, his voice low and dangerous. "You don't hit children in a courtroom. You don't hit anyone. Period." The judge stepped behind the bench, composed herself, and tapped her gavel. "Let's get one thing straight. This courtroom is a place of law and order. Officer Halbridge, you are relieved of duty until further notice. Security will escort you out." Two deputies standing by the wall moved toward Halbridge. He started to protest but caught Darius's stare, and stopped. As the officer was led out, Marcus rubbed the red mark on his cheek. His father finally looked at him, the anger softening in his eyes. "You okay?" Darius asked quietly. Marcus nodded. But the silence in the courtroom had turned into whispers now. Phones were being pulled out. People were texting. Something rare had just happened, justice moved in real time, and someone with authority had stepped in not to protect power, but to protect someone without it. And it was just beginning. The moment Officer Halbridge was escorted out, the courtroom buzz intensified. Reporters, who had only shown up to cover what they thought was a routine juvenile hearing, were now rapidly scribbling notes or typing frantically on their phones. Special Agent Darius Lane stood tall but silent beside his son. His face had shifted from fury to focus. He scanned the courtroom with the sharp eyes of someone used to being in control, someone who had dealt with messes far bigger than this, but who wasn't about to let this one go unaddressed. The judge cleared her throat. "This court will recess for 10 minutes, she said, though no one moved. "Agent Lane, please remain. I'd like to speak with you privately." Darius gave a respectful nod. "Of course, Your Honor." The public defender leaned over to Marcus. "Kid. I had no idea your father was." Marcus gave a small shrug. "He told me not to bring it up. Said people treat you different when they know." "I get it," the lawyer said. "But you're lucky he walked in when he did." Marcus looked down again, quieter than ever. "He always walks in. Even when he's late." Back in chambers, behind the heavy wooden door, Judge McAllister leaned forward in her chair, arms folded on her desk. "Agent Lane," she said with careful restraint, "I need to know, are you here just as a father, or as a federal officer?" Darius didn't hesitate. "Both. But primarily a father. I didn't flash the badge to make a scene. I did it because your courtroom just became a crime scene." She didn't flinch at his words. "I'll be filing an official complaint," he continued. "I'm requesting surveillance footage, sworn statements from every witness, and I want Halbridge's personnel file. You know as well as I do, this wasn't the first time." Judge McAllister sighed. "No. It wasn't." Meanwhile, outside the courtroom, someone had uploaded a video of the slap, captured from a shaky phone held low under a coat sleeve. The sound of the officer's hand meeting Marcus's face, the collective gasp, and Darius's entrance, all of it, was already circling social media. And climbing. The storm was coming fast. By the time the courtroom reconvened 20 minutes later, the atmosphere had shifted completely. People weren't just watching the case, they were watching history unfold. Dozens of phones were discreetly recording. More people had shown up, crowding into the hallways, peeking through the doors. The video had already gone viral. Headlines online read things like, "Courtroom Chaos, Officer Strikes Teen, Doesn't Know His Dad's a Federal Agent, Justice Served Instantly, Agent Confronts Officer After Slap, Who is Darius Lane?" The man who walked in and changed everything. Inside, Marcus sat straighter. He wasn't used to this kind of attention. The red imprint on his face was still faintly visible, though cooling now. His father remained by his side, composed but watchful, his presence impossible to ignore. Judge McAllister tapped her gavel again. "We are back in session. Before we proceed with the hearing, I have a statement to make." The room fell still. "I want to acknowledge an incident that occurred in this courtroom earlier this morning. Officer Halbridge's conduct was not only unprofessional, it violated the standards we expect from any officer of the law. His actions are being investigated immediately and thoroughly." She paused, scanning the room. "To Mr. Marcus Lane, I want to personally apologize on behalf of this court. No one should fear being harmed in a courtroom, especially not a young citizen appearing voluntarily for a hearing." Marcus said nothing but gave a respectful nod. The judge turned to Darius. "Special Agent Lane, while your presence wasn't anticipated today, I thank you for your calm and direct intervention. Your restraint did more to restore order than any badge could." Darius stood. "Thank you, Your Honor. My son came here to face the law fairly. He'll still do that." The judge nodded approvingly. "Then let us continue, fairly, and with full transparency." But even as the hearing resumed, something else was building outside those courtroom walls. The mayor's office had just called the courthouse. The chief of police wanted a meeting. And several national outlets had picked up the story, each asking the same question: if this could happen to a federal agent's son, how many others had it already happened to, without anyone watching? As the courtroom returned to routine procedures, the energy inside remained anything but normal. Every word spoken seemed sharper, every eye more alert. What was once a quiet local hearing had turned into the epicenter of a national conversation. Outside the courthouse, the crowd had doubled. News vans lined the curb. Reporters with microphones were standing beneath hastily raised tripods, narrating the now viral event as it unfolded in real time. Inside, Marcus's hearing proceeded. The judge was more focused than ever, giving the young man a fair opportunity to speak and question the charge of disorderly conduct placed on him by the school officer. Marcus answered each question clearly, respectfully. When asked what had happened that day at school, he explained, the officer had misunderstood a situation between him and another student, raised his voice, and Marcus, unintentionally, had done the worst thing a teenager could do to an adult on a power trip. He told the truth. He was wrong, Marcus said calmly. And I said so. I didn't yell. I just didn't back down. The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably. Darius sat quietly, proud but not intervening. He wanted his son to handle it on his own. That's what they'd raised him for. Judge McAllister leaned back after hearing everything. It seems to me, she said, this case should never have left the school office, let alone entered this courtroom. Then she looked at Marcus. Case dismissed. The gavel fell. A cheer almost broke out from the back of the room, but people restrained themselves. Darius stood and shook his son's hand, firm, like equals. Marcus looked like he wanted to smile but didn't quite know how. As they walked toward the doors, someone from the press called out, Agent Lane. Do you have a comment? Darius paused. Cameras flashed. He looked directly at them and said, I'm not here to make speeches. I'm here because a line was crossed. If people want change, it starts with accountability, for everyone. Including people in uniform. Then he turned to Marcus. Let's go. They stepped outside into the roar of the press, hand on shoulder, father and son walking through the chaos they didn't ask for, but were fully prepared to face. And somewhere across the city, Officer Halbridge sat alone in a holding room, a department lawyer already whispering damage control. But this time, it might be too late. While the courthouse buzzed and headlines lit up every major news outlet, a different kind of conversation was taking place downtown, far from cameras and microphones. Inside a tall government building, behind a polished oak door labeled Internal Oversight Division, 3 senior officials sat in a closed session. He struck a teenager in open court, one of them said, voice low but seething. And not just any teen, Agent Lane's son. Another leaned back. Do you understand how bad this is for the department? It's not just optics anymore. It's policy failure, culture failure, systemic exposure. The third official, a woman with a reputation for cleaning up departmental messes, tapped her pen slowly. And Halbridge's personnel file, she asked. The first official slid a manila folder across the table. She opened it, scanned a few lines, and let out a breath through her nose. For prior complaints of excessive force. All unresolved. All internally buried. She closed the folder. Not anymore. Back at the precinct, Halbridge sat at a desk in the Internal Affairs interview room. His badge and gun had been taken. His mouth was tight, his leg bouncing. A younger officer stood outside, watching him through the glass. Think he's gonna get canned? Another replied, does it matter? His name's everywhere now. His face is viral. No shield can protect him from this one. Inside the interview room, Halbridge was asked a single question, what made you put hands on a minor, in a courtroom, with a judge steps away? He didn't answer. He just stared at the table. Meanwhile, Marcus and his father were already home. The front lawn had press vans parked on the street, but Darius had set a hard boundary, no interviews, no cameras inside. Marcus sat on the couch, finally letting his shoulders drop. You mad I didn't tell them who you were sooner? He asked. Darius shook his head. No. You handled it better than I ever could have expected. You stood up with your words. That's stronger than any badge I could flash. Marcus looked at him. Does this change anything? Darius nodded slowly. Yeah. Everything. Within 48 hours, the incident had become a full-blown national conversation. Morning shows ran segments titled, "Courtroom Assault or Abuse of Power." Experts debated policy. Editorials poured in. Hashtags trended, hashtag Justice for Marcus, hashtag Courtroom Integrity, hashtag Halbridge Incident. But what shocked city officials even more was how quickly public support rallied behind the Lane family, not because of Agent Darius's title, but because of how quietly and firmly he had handled it. He hadn't made threats. He didn't call a press conference. He had simply stood up when no one else did. That kind of strength, people noticed. At the city council's emergency meeting, held late that Friday night, the mayor sat stone-faced as angry citizens lined up during the public comment session. This didn't happen in an alley. It happened in a courtroom, one woman shouted. What if that video never got out? Would anything have changed? A teacher asked. A retired judge stood and said flatly, that officer not only broke protocol, he shattered public trust. By the time the meeting ended, the city council voted unanimously to launch a full investigation into courtroom security protocols, and for the first time in over a decade, proposed creating an independent civilian oversight board. At home, Marcus watched it all on TV with a kind of disbelief. I didn't think it'd get this big, he said quietly. His grandmother, sitting beside him with her knitting in her lap, didn't look away from the screen. Big things start small, she said. But truth doesn't stay quiet forever. Meanwhile, Darius had returned to work. His office was swamped with interview requests, press calls, and even calls from senior officials in Washington. But he ignored most of them. Instead, he sent a single memo to his division: justice doesn't depend on titles or timing. It depends on action. And it starts in the moments where no one thinks you're watching. He signed it simply, DL, and across the city, a courtroom seat once occupied by Officer Halbridge now sat empty. But the system that allowed him to act unchecked? That was no longer untouched. By the start of the following week, the consequences were no longer theoretical, they were real, swift, and unavoidable. Officer Halbridge had been placed under formal investigation not only for the courtroom incident but also for multiple complaints that had long collected dust in an internal drawer. Now, each one was being re-examined publicly. His union attorney scrambled to manage the fallout, but it was too late. His face was plastered across national broadcasts, accompanied by headlines like, "Pattern of Aggression. Officer under scrutiny after courtroom assault, internal affairs quiet no longer, old complaints surface in wake of viral incident." Back at the courthouse, Judge McAllister issued an open letter. "We failed to protect a young man within these walls. That will never happen again. Reforms begin immediately." One of the first changes, courtroom officers would now wear active body cameras. Mandatory de-escalation training was introduced. And no officer with an open conduct review would be allowed to serve inside the courtroom until cleared. And Marcus? He returned to school on Monday, trying to slip in quietly through the back doors. It didn't work. Students whispered. Some clapped. One girl walked up to him in the hallway and said, "What your dad did." That gave all of us a little more courage. Marcus didn't know what to say. So he nodded, and kept walking. In his locker sat a note someone had slid through the vent: "You didn't raise your voice. You didn't swing. You stood your ground. That's real strength." At home, Darius watched the city begin to reshape itself. Calls from other jurisdictions started trickling in, quiet questions about his statement, his stance, and whether he'd help advise other departments. He wasn't interested in fame. He was interested in making sure no other father had to walk through those doors the way he did. He looked out the window, where the press vans had finally left. Peace had returned. But something else had arrived with it: momentum. And momentum, when used right, could shake the foundations of power. As word of the reform spread, Marcus's story began to take on a life beyond the courtroom. College debate teams referenced it. Law students dissected it. One civics teacher built a week-long lesson plan around the incident, titled Courage and Accountability in Public Institutions. Agent Darius Lane, however, stayed mostly out of the spotlight. He declined nearly every major interview, except one. It was a sit-down conversation with a small local news station that had covered the courtroom from the beginning. No flashing lights. No scripted questions. Just a quiet room, one camera, and a thoughtful reporter. "Why come forward now?" she asked him. Darius leaned forward. "Because people need to understand this wasn't about who I am. It's about what that officer did. To any kid. In a place where no one should ever be touched or intimidated." He paused. "And because silence gives permission." The interview aired that evening, simple and unpolished. And it resonated deeply. That same night, an unexpected message arrived at Darius's office. It came from the governor's liaison. A formal request. They wanted him to chair a new state-level oversight committee, one that would help set the tone for courtroom safety and officer conduct across all jurisdictions. Darius sat with the letter for a long time. He knew accepting it would change everything again. More pressure. More exposure. More responsibility. But then he thought of Marcus. And of the slap that echoed around a courtroom, and had since echoed around a nation. He picked up a pen. Signed the acceptance form. And whispered, "Let's make sure this never has to happen again." 6 months later, the courtroom looked different. Gone were the days of unchecked silence. Officers stationed inside wore visible body cams, and every new recruit received rigorous courtroom conduct training. A plaque now hung outside the entrance, "Justice must begin with safety," dedicated to every voice that refused to stay silent. Inside, Judge McAllister presided over another routine hearing. But nothing about the court felt routine anymore. People watched now, closer, louder, bolder. And in the back row sat Marcus Lane. He wasn't in handcuffs. He wasn't a defendant. He wasn't scared. He was a guest of the court, invited by the judge to speak to a group of high schoolers who were visiting that day to learn about civic responsibility. When his name was called, he stood up, walked slowly to the front, and looked out at a room full of young faces. "My name is Marcus Lane," he began. "And the first time I was in this courtroom, I thought I didn't belong here. That I didn't have a voice." He paused. "But I learned something. You don't need a badge, a title, or a podium to speak truth. You just need courage. And you only need it for one moment." Behind him, his father stood silently in the gallery, arms crossed, not to guard, but to support. Just a father. Just proud. After the session ended, Judge McAllister shook Marcus's hand and smiled warmly. "You changed more here in one day than most people do in a career." Marcus didn't know what to say to that. So he nodded, like he always did. Outside the courthouse, there were no reporters this time. No flashing cameras. Just a calm breeze, a clear sky, and the quiet strength of a young man walking out on his own terms. Not as a headline. But as a symbol of change. 2 weeks after Marcus spoke in the courtroom, something happened no one expected. A letter arrived at the Lane household, handwritten, in a plain white envelope with no return address. Darius opened it cautiously. Inside was a folded sheet of lined paper. The handwriting was messy but deliberate. "To Marcus Lane, what I did was wrong. Not just in that courtroom, but long before that. I've worn a badge for years, but I forgot why I put it on in the first place. You didn't deserve what happened. No one does. I lost everything, my job, my reputation, but maybe that's what I needed to see clearly. I don't expect forgiveness. I just want you to know, you opened my eyes." Halbridge Darius read the letter twice before handing it silently to his son. Marcus didn't say anything for a while. He just sat with it. Processing. Finally, he folded it back up and said, "I'm not sure how I feel about that." "You don't have to feel anything right now," Darius replied. "You already did what most people never do. You stood up, and the world listened." Marcus nodded, his eyes distant. Later that night, he tucked the letter into a box under his bed, a box where he kept things he couldn't quite make sense of yet, but knew mattered. That was the thing about what happened. The moment had passed. The media had moved on. The courtroom had changed. But the impact, the kind that starts in one room and spreads through a system, was still echoing. And it would keep echoing, every time a kid decided not to stay silent. Every time a parent walked through a courthouse door with calm resolve instead of fear. Every time someone remembered, it takes only one moment to turn silence into strength. And one person to change everything,